We're going to read a short passage in James chapter 1 and continue this second segment of this series of growing through grief. And this one in particular deals with the principle of surrendering to the process. You know, sometimes it's a big step in the right direction. Just taking a step back and resigning that God has this happening in our lives for a reason, and we want to surrender to Him through the process of our grief and what He's trying to do in our lives. So we're going to read James 1, and I'll read the first 8 verses and then jump into this. James, the servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greeting. My brethren, count it all joy. He just gets right into it. Count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavereth is like the wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. But let not that man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. It's difficult to persevere through trying situations. It's especially difficult when we've tried it a while. We're trying to, put our best foot forward, put our chin up, and go through this difficulty, and we don't see any practical benefit. It just seems to linger on and linger on. And some of our grief is caused by circumstances that are not likely to go away soon. Maybe will never go away. And so, we can endure some things and toughen up a little bit, but after a while, if you don't see a reason behind keeping a good attitude towards the situation, it's easy to let our guard down and just, let our true emotions come out and falter under that difficult situation. So we shouldn't try to escape those situations, but rather surrender ourselves to the Lord. And in that process, see what it is that God is trying to teach us. We want to see growth. I remember when I was a little kid, we had 8 boys in the family, and we were always vying for superiority one way or another. I was in the middle of the pack in every way. I was in the middle of the pack. Age-wise, I wasn't the dumbest brother, but I surely wasn't the smartest either. I wasn't the most athletic brother, but I could get out and play with the rest of them in the park. I was just kind of stuck in. I was always striving to be better than my brothers in something, and kids, when they're younger, they want to grow up. They want to get taller. Now, in my day, you just put marks on the wall. In our hallway, we had a place on the corner where we'd line up there and we'd put a mark, and we'd want to see, and it sometimes seemed like I was regressing, we'd put the line there, and I haven't grown at all. So I think I went 1/8 of an inch smaller than I was last month, and we have those marks. Nowadays, they do charts and so forth, and I know the Rockies had an elaborate wooden thing that used to mark the growth of your kids. You want to see, kids want to feel like they're growing up. We want to feel like we're getting smarter, don't we? Yeah. I hope. I'm challenging the kids in our school to keep that as an ever-present goal in our life. We want you to get smarter, and so we do things to increase our education. Athletes want to be better at their sport. All of these things are measurable. You can put a little line on the ceiling, on the wall, if you're hitting the ceiling, you're way too tall, on the wall, and see that little line go up all the time. You can take tests to see if you're getting smarter. I've never taken one, but I thought it was interesting to take an IQ test. I think if I took one, I'd be deflated for the rest of my life. But if you wanted to see if you're getting smarter, you could take an SAT exam or something to see that. Even athletes can check their progress by, statistical information. They scored more touchdowns or made more points or hit more home runs. But how do you measure, and those of you who are married, how do you measure whether you've been growing in your role as a husband or wife this past year? How can you measure that? How can you tell whether you're a better parent now than you were 5 years ago? How can you tell whether you're growing in your spiritual life? What is there to measure to indicate to you yourself or others that you have really grown a lot in your spiritual life? These are all kind of nebulous. It's hard to determine. How do you know when you are growing through grief? What do you do to track that kind of a thing? The easy answer to that question is according to the book of Romans, the one underlying goal that we should have in getting through difficult times is, am I becoming more like my Savior through this difficulty, this situation in my life? Romans 8:29 says, for whom we did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son. Are you becoming more like Jesus Christ? Even then, that's hard to track on a day-by-day basis because we have ups and we have downs. And sometimes it takes a long period of time to look back and track or measure whether that situation that God brought into your life has made you a better Christian, stronger in your walk with the Lord. Growth through grief is particularly challenging because we don't have a clear and objective way of measuring spiritual growth like that. It's just hard to do that. And really, most of us, when we go through deep enough waters, we're just trying to make it through the day, and we're not dealing with the spiritual aspects of what is happening in our life. We feel like that's going to come one way or another. We're just dealing with the emotional, mental. We talked a lot about that last week, the emotional and the mental aspects, and sometimes it's even it's a physical challenge for us. Let me list some of the things that happen when people go through grief in their lives. Sometimes there's a loss of appetite, and they know something's wrong because they have a healthy relationship with food, but they don't feel like eating. And there's no way to explain that. I mean, we eat every day, right? All of a sudden, we go through this deep valley in our lives, and we no longer have a desire to eat a simple meal. That's a good indication, folks, that we're dealing with a level of grief that we need to pay some attention to that. There's stomach pain, nausea, chest pain. Literally, we say this, our hearts ache. Our hearts are aching, and we feel a physical pain. There's exhaustion. We're completely exhausted. We have no energy. But then we go to bed, and guess what? We can't sleep. You know, it's like, I'm totally worn out, but I go to bed, and I can't seem to fall asleep or get a good night's sleep. There's the uncontrollable emotional swings and mental confusion that many people report when they go through grief. We kind of describe it as it's sort of like a fog. We're going through the fog. It's like this is surreal. And we wake up the next morning, and the first few seconds we process and we say, did I just dream that, or is this really happening to me? And we realize it's really happening to me. Those are just the physical aspects of that. Did you know that people in the Bible went through some of those and they addressed those? They explained the things that were happening to them physically. Now, we know David, who was very transparent and wrote many of the Psalms. David discusses the emotional and mental aspects of his trials and his problems in life. A lot of them were self-inflicted, and his went over a period of many years. And we gained great encouragement. But, you know, David also expressed some physical reactions to his grief. Let me share an example of that. I'm going to quote out of Psalm 102. He says, for my days are consumed like smoke, and my bones are burned as an hearth. My heart is smitten. See that heartache? We call it heartache. David had heartache. He said, my heart is smitten and withered like grass, so that I forget to eat my bread. There's loss of appetite there. By reason of the voice of my groaning, my bones cleave to my skin. David is sharing the physical effects of the process of going through grief. We quoted last week a passage from Lamentations regarding Jeremiah, just to refresh your memory if you were not here. Jeremiah lived during the time of the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem. Everything that had been built, the greatest empire, the glory years of David's kingdom, and all that happened, the years of the kings and the crusades, and you know, Israel is power on earth, and they saw the Babylonians come in and almost literally overnight destroy all of it. They ransacked the city, burned much of it down. They destroyed the temple, carried away the artifacts, took the men for indentured servants, slave labor, killed many of them, left many of the women and children behind. And Jeremiah is witnessing this destruction of the holy city of God. It went beyond just military power coming in and overtaking us. The Jews believed that, you know, God had chosen them as his special people, and this is the headquarters of God on earth. This is where the temple was. This is where the priests met with God, and God intervene for his people, as he'd done so many times before. And he saw all of that ruined before his eyes. And listen to his words in Jeremiah 2, verse 11, because it involves his physical reaction to this grief. He said, "Mine eyes do fail with tears." In other words, remember I talked about that, where we cry till we can cry no more? Mine eyes did fail with tears. My bowels, that was believed to be the seat of their emotions. It's the word there in Hebrew is the compassionate feelings and the tender mercies. My bowels are troubled. My liver is poured upon the earth. I didn't know what he meant by that. Nobody knows for sure, but some commentaries believe that meant that he, how do I say this delicately? He lost his cookies. He was so overcome with grief, he was nauseous. Remember, I listed one of the physical effects? He got sick and he's throwing up, and he felt like my liver is being poured out on the ground. Not a pretty picture, but I want you to get a real idea of what grief can do to us physically. He said, "For the destruction of the daughter of my people, because the children of the sucklings swoon in the streets of the city." He looked at the orphan children and the mothers and teenage girls wandering around this desolate city, still ashes and smoke rising to the sky. And he looked at all this and he said, I physically lost it. I got sick. I was numb. I cried till I couldn't cry anymore. These situations involve a level of grief that very few of us are acquainted with. But if you have been there, or you are presently there, you can identify with what these writers are saying, how our grief can even affect us physically. And I share these reactions for the benefit of those of you who have people in your life that come to you during your time of grief and they say something like this: "Get over it. Deal with it. Suck it up. You need to go on." And by the way, they say that because they are hurting for your pain. And they assume that sooner or later you're going to get over this and you're going to go on with your life. And they see how the patterns that have developed in people's lives who go through grief are so deep-seated, they want them to break out of that, get out of that, and go on with their life. As bad as it is, it's going to get better down the road. And sometimes we need to give people like that a little bit of room. I think they're operating on the basis of our well-being, and they love us and care about us and are trying to get us to break out of our grief, but sometimes those words aren't exactly helpful. We can go to the Bible for encouragement, but if that's all you get from the Word of God, you are shortchanging yourself. You ought to go to the Bible for encouragement. You got to find something, go to the Psalms or Philippians or somewhere and find something that will encourage you and get you through. But the Bible offers so much more than just, here's your verse for the day to get you through the day. Amen. It has instruction for us. It has helpful advice for us. And James knew what it was to deal with people who are overcome with grief. Did you see that first verse there in our text? James, the servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. Scattered abroad. Meaning that the persecution against Christians was so intense and so severe, they had to literally flee for their lives. The book of Acts deals with some of the details, not all of them, but some of the details about what was going on in the church, that the very people that James was writing to at that time. We know from Acts chapter 7 that Stephen is stoned to death. The first Christian martyr. The first of what would be many Christian martyrs. He is killed simply because he was preaching the gospel. We know in Acts chapter 8 that this persecution intensified and it became more widespread. In fact, I was reading that passage this morning and I thought to myself, I've got to read. I want you to get an accurate idea of what's happening to God's people, the very people James is writing to. Listen to Acts chapter 8. "And Saul was consenting unto his death," speaking of Stephen's death, "and at that time there was a great persecution against the church which is at Jerusalem. And they were all scattered abroad." The very words that James uses in James chapter 1, verse 1. They were scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. And devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over him. He was a wonderful man, and his loss was felt greatly among God's people. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house and hailing men and women, committed them to prison. Therefore they that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the word. So Stephen is killed, chapter 7. Acts chapter 8, the persecution is so great that Christians are literally fleeing for their lives. In Acts chapter 12, James, the brother of John, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, James was beheaded for his faith in Acts chapter 15. Another martyr. This time it's closer to home because this is one of the church leaders. This is one of the apostles is killed. All of the apostles, save John who was exiled and Judas who hung himself, were killed, were martyred for their faith. Acts chapter 12 tells us that Peter's arrested, but for the intervention of God and the release from prison by an angel, he was scheduled to be killed too. That would have been a real difficult stage for the church to lose both James and Peter at the same time. All these things were going on in the church. We learn in chapter 15 that James, who is the half-brother of Jesus, not the same James who was beheaded, James, the half-brother of Jesus, became a Christian and became a leader in the church. And he was the pastor at the Church of Jerusalem. He is the James that wrote the book of James. He is the one that said that the 12 tribes were scattered abroad. He's writing a letter to try to encourage them to deal with their grief. And he's talking about people who had to flee their homes. They lost their jobs, everything that was familiar to them. They had seen many of their loved ones and friends, perhaps their pastor, brutally murdered. They thought the same thing was going to happen to them. The ones who were not killed, many of them were in prison, and Paul had a major role in all of that. They were watching all of these things unfold before their lives. They were scattered. And James writes this letter very matter-of-factly. He doesn't waste time getting into it. Very practically, to talk to these Christians who had to leave and flee Jerusalem, lost their homes, lost their possessions. Some of them were in prison. Many of them were killed. He's writing to survivors who had to flee for their lives, and he's trying to give them some instructions, not a verse for the day. They needed more than a verse for the day. They needed some practical advice from God as to how they could go on with their lives under these current circumstances. And that's what this passage was all about. I'm going to do the same thing I did. I quite frankly could have easily taken this surrendering to the process. I could have taken that topic and made 4 lessons out of it, but I'm committing myself to condensing it the best I can. I'm going to take 2 weeks with each passage. The last 2 weeks we looked at the story of Lazarus. Remember that? And Jesus coming to offer help and encouragement to Mary and Martha and the people in the community. We'll take this week and next week and deal with the subject of James and what he's trying to do here. And this one involves surrendering to the process of our grief. Accepting it, owning it, realizing that God has a greater purpose in it. So the point I want you to consider today is a heavenly purpose. The first thing that James does, he tries to help us to see why this is happening. He wants to frame this situation for us. And he tells us there's a purpose in this. He was telling the believers there, but really for all of our benefits, there was something happening that they could not easily see. It's like taking a picture and taking a camera that you can zoom in on it really close and taking a picture of it. And if you were to do that and show it on a screen, I would have gone through the trouble of doing that. But my technical skills, guys, is really low. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to take somebody else's picture and do that even. But it was a busy week for us. Maybe I should have done that. Pastor Joe could have figured it out. But if I had taken I was thinking in my office about getting a picture of the Mona Lisa, a very easily identified picture, and taking a real close-up view of that, really close-up view, and put it on the screen. And I would say to you, what is that a picture of? And you'd be like, it's a bunch of scattered colors. I don't know. And then when you go and scan back out of that and look at the whole picture, you say, oh, I know what that picture is. That picture has been around for years. It's a famous picture. When we're in our grief, we're looking at the close-up view. We only think about ourselves and what we're going through and how we're going to get through this thing. We're not zooming back on that picture and saying, God probably has a greater purpose in this. I don't know what it is just yet, but God is trying to do something in my life to help me through this. He says, my brethren, count it all joy. Count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations. Why? Knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. That word count means to account it as or to consider. To go back and think about what we're going through and maybe a greater purpose in all of that. I was working with some of the junior hires this past week in their math. They had some kind of assignment where they had to get an amount of a product and then find if they buy it, they have to pay an interest on that, and then what they would resell it for, they have to determine whether they would make money or lose money and put it in the appropriate category. I thought that's a good thing to teach junior hires, because sometimes money it's like water with kids, man. They got money, they can't wait to spend their money, and sometimes if they can invest it, they say, oh, that makes more money. And sometimes when they blow it, they say, oh, that really wasn't a smart decision. I'll try not to do that again. It's a good lesson to learn. They had to figure out whether it was a gain or a loss. Two categories. In our life, as we go through trials, we think about our losses. Remember, I said the first week, I said that one of the most common characteristics of grief is that it involves some kind of a loss. We lose someone or something. We lose our health. We lose our independence. We lose our finances. Grief is caused by a sense of loss. We all lose something in the process. But we don't readily think that, hey, but there's something to be gained here too. Yeah, I'm going through this suffering. Yes, I'm scattered. I had to leave my home. I lost my job. My friend got killed. And my other friends had everything taken from them because they believed in Jesus Christ. But there's also that gains category. And in this case, the gain that James was referring to, one of many things that happened during our grief, was patience. Some of us, speaking of my wife, could use a little more patience. I'm teasing, because if you were to ask my wife, the one of many flaws about me and my life and my interaction with my wife, the one that drives her the most crazy is I seem to, for some reason, sometimes lack a little bit of patience in circumstances. But, God is working on that. And one way He works on giving us patience is by giving you grief. In many different ways. And He keeps us in situations like that so we don't just easily get out of it and bag out and bail out and then don't learn the lesson. He may put us in a situation like that, and for no other reason than to teach us some patience. And patience here is much more than just my emotional state. It is my disposition when difficulties and trials come our way. We're only looking at the close-up view, but God is at work in our lives. Philippians 1:6 is being confident of this very thing, that He which hath begun a good work in you will perform it unto the day of Jesus Christ. He's always at work in our lives through various circumstances, including difficult ones. He's trying to teach us things and grow us through that. So this process that's taking place that we have to surrender to involves two things. Number one, it's there to develop our faith. I want you to remember the statement because I'll use it a lot in the course of this study. We are either going through grief or we're growing through grief. You see the difference there? We're either going through it, and some of you are pretty strong-willed and you're strong of character. And some of you have been through enough difficult times where the little things you don't sweat those anymore. And there have to be escalating effects of grief in your life for you to really be taken back by it because you've developed a resistance to it. And God is going to have to do whatever to teach us the things that He wants us to do to conform us to the image of Jesus Christ. And so some of you would just say, I'm just going to go through, I'm just going to endure this till it goes away. It's happened before. And you may find some success in it. I won't say that's completely unsuccessful. By sheer determination and will, you can get through difficult times, and whatever works for you, you can try that and get through that time. But there will be times for all of us when that alone will not work. You have to say, I'm not just going to go through this, I want to grow. That's surrendering to the process. Surrendering to the process means I'm going to become a better person. I'm going to let God make me a better person through this time of grief in my life. If you're determined to grow, God will make of your life something wonderful and beautiful and encouragement to other people as well. And that's what the Christian life is all about. The reality and depth of your grief will have a direct effect upon the reality and depth of your faith. And, we can all, it's easy for us to trust God when things are going well. I'm the best Christian in the world when I have no problems. I'm not in that stage often, but sometimes I get to this place, I'm like, oh, good. Everything's going good. Don't touch anything. Don't do anything. Everything's great. Leave it like it is. And I'm a great Christian then. You come to me, oh, wow, talk about God's goodness in my life and how God's met my needs and everything. And then the bottom falls out. All of a sudden, I'm not such a good Christian anymore. The real test of my character is showing there. James 1, verse 3 talks about the trying of your faith. Well, most of you know that word means it's like a test. He's going to test it. He's going to put that faith to the test and see. And by the way, untested faith is unreliable faith. If God never tested our faith, we wouldn't be able to count on it down the road. And we'd be blindsided and we'd be a shipwreck if there weren't stages along the way where God tested that faith to see how we're going to do under those circumstances, so when the big one comes down the road, we can stand on our own 2 feet and make it through that difficult time. But God is seeking to develop faith. It's to grow our faith through those times. So not only to develop our faith, but also to develop our endurance. I said a while ago that God does not always reveal his reasons for why he's allowed grief into our life. I would be a successful millionaire. I'd write books and go to seminars if I could tell everybody, I have the uncanny ability. God's given us the ability to tell you why you're going through that problem. You people would be lining up at the door. Because as long as they knew why, it would make it more bearable for them. They said, we can go to a guy that will tell us why this is happening in our lives, and now that I know it, I can put it in its proper context and go on with my life. I can't do that. In fact, sometimes you go days, weeks, months, or years, and you still won't have an answer to that question. God, why did this happen to me? By the way, if you find somebody to tell you they can tell you all those answers to that, be wary of that person. They have their own set of problems and issues, they're going through. God may never reveal why he allows something to come into your life. And when you get to heaven, you have to get all that sorted out the best you can. But the time between the incident that caused all this grief and the time that God, if and when he reveals to you why it happened, and some of us have been there, and we look back now and we say, okay, I get it now. Now I understand why God allowed that to happen. I didn't understand at the time, but I'm thankfully able to look back now over a period of time and say, oh, that's why God allowed that into my life. That time between when the grief showed up in your life and the time that God finally reveals to you why he allowed that in your life is the area of endurance. How will you endure the circumstances when you're physically affected, when you're emotionally, mentally affected by those things? Romans 5:3 says, we glory in tribulations, knowing that the tribulation worketh patience. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't find it easy to glory in my tribulation. Quite the opposite. I'm a pretty good complainer. I don't do it around the church because my wife knows I'm on the pastoral staff and I have to look spiritual to all of them. But if you want to talk to her, she'll tell you when things aren't going so well. My disposition has changed a little bit around. I sometimes struggle a little bit with that, and somebody says something to me that doesn't bother me, but something doesn't go well in my life, and I become grumpy pants. You know what I mean? I'm Captain Grumpy Pants, and my poor wife. Sometimes she literally has to leave the house. She comes back, thankfully, but she calls it giving me space. I call it maintaining her sanity. Get away for a little while. We'd be grumpy on my own. Because I'm going to glory in my tribulation. That's a hard thing. That's a hard thing to do. I'm going to relish this opportunity. God's going to grow me through this. This is great. I hope it happens again next week. We usually do not have that disposition when difficulties come. But patience is really the same thing as endurance. God is teaching us endurance or patience through our tribulation period in life. There's a woman by the name of Florence Chadwick. I recently saw a documentary on a woman swimmer. She was a long-distance swimmer. No, I'm not talking about the pool. I'm talking about out in the ocean, long-distance swimmer. And I don't know if it's the same lady or not. I can't remember the name of the woman I saw in that movie. It was a very inspiring movie. But this woman is either the same or another woman who was a long-distance swimmer, open water swimmer. She was the first woman to swim the English Channel. Men had done it before. And by the way, some people attempted it and died. It wasn't an easy thing. They started bringing boats alongside the people so that if they got into a bad spot, they could be rescued. It was, and circumstances, the condition of the waves, the temperature of the water, all of that. I mean, we're talking hours and hours and hours on an open ocean, just swimming and swimming and swimming. But she broke several time records in different swims. She was the first person, not first woman, others have done it since, but she was the first person who swam the English Channel both ways. Not the same day. But she swam it and then did, I guess one direction is much easier than another. It's easier to make it, and she did it both ways. One day, a male swimmer, no doubt a chauvinist, said, I can't believe a woman's out there. She holds the record for that. I'm going to train. And he beat her record by 36 minutes, by the way. And she was there when he got to the other side to greet him and to congratulate him on his feat. Very humble woman. There's a picture of her. The newspaper agency took a picture of her congratulating this man for breaking her record. But she went out a few weeks later, 6 weeks later to be exact, and she swam it again, breaking his record by 11 minutes. She was just that kind of a gal, She was very determined, very determined. I give credit to anybody who go out and swim in the ocean. There are things out there that can eat you. And I don't like the cold, and it's frigid cold. But the story I want to tell you occurred in 1952. She set out to, she wanted a new challenge. So she said she's going to swim from Catalina Island to a spot on the California coast. It's a distance of about 26 miles, the same distance that runners run in a marathon. And so she trained for it, jumped in, and she was going along, and she had been in the water for about 15 hours. And of course, your body is just you need nutrition, you're aching, it's frigid and cold, and all of these conditions come up, your mind starts playing tricks on you, and there's sometimes a feeling by some of these swimmers that they're not even sure they're going in the right direction. Your mind plays tricks on you. And anyway, that particular day when she was swimming that distance, a fog set in off the coast. It's very common off the coast of California. A fog set in, and it made it difficult for her to navigate where she was going. And finally, her mother was in a boat that was following her. Someone would follow these long-distance swimmers to keep them, safe and alive. And she yelled to her mother, and she said, Mom, I don't think I can make it. Well, they are given strict instructions not to tell there's people on board to verify this, not to tell the swimmer where they are or give them technical information or advice. They're assuming that on their own. Only thing they can do is they can drop some food or some drink to give them something to eat or drink in the water, but they can't advise them or coach them in these when they're seeking to break records to do these things. And so she told her mom she didn't think she could make it, and she went a little bit further, and then finally she said, let me in. And they did. They let her into the boat, and she discovered, but she was very disappointed to find out she was less than a mile from the shore. And so all that was aborted. The next day she said to a television interviewer, she said, I'm not excusing myself, but if I could have seen the land, I think I might have made it. I'm sure she would have made it. If I could have seen how close I was, I would have easily kept on and I would have completed this feat. I want you to remember that story because that's kind of how it is when you go through grief. You don't see for the fog. You don't really know. You don't really know what's going on. You don't have all the answers, and it can discourage you. But James says, the trial of your faith brings about patience, endurance. If you remember that, then you can go through these situations and say, God is preparing me for something bigger down the road. God is making me stronger. He's developing endurance in my life. He is conforming me to the image of His Son. So let's tackle it. Let's surrender to the process. We'll pick up some other principles, really important principles from the book of James next week. But I share that for the benefit of those who are going through difficult times or will be going through them. You don't have to see everything. You don't have to see the shore. In the fog, know that God is with you every stroke of your race. Father, we